You're going to be making 2 dart samples, and hopefully they'll be fun enough and you'll be able to understand how darts work while making them. The first sample is going to be very precise. You're going to lay everything out. All the markings are going to be laid out ahead of time, and then you're going to sew after everything is laid out. And for the second sample, it's going to be fairly organic, way easier, kind of freehand style sample that will look hopefully somewhat like this. The first thing I want you to do is to find a large plate around your house, unless you have a compass that would allow you to make a circle on your fabric. But if you don't have a compass that's large enough, you can go ahead and find a large plate around your house and flip it over and trace it over your fabric. And then cut out 2 circles. The first circle is going to be used for your precise dart sample, and the second is going to be used for the organic pattern. So once you have a circle cut out, the very first thing you want to do is establish a center. And the way you want to do it is by folding your circle once into a half. And this is where having an iron could be extremely handy, because you can make this crease with an iron. Since most of you will not have it, I'm going to demonstrate this without using the iron. But this is where an iron would be super handy. Then you want to fold the circle into a quarter, size like that. And this fold already will allow us to go ahead and establish the center. And we can just go ahead and mark our center with a pencil. So now we have a center. And if we open this up, there's our center. While the fold marks are still fresh, we're going to go ahead and mark those lines with a ruler and a pencil. Again, if you had an iron, you wouldn't have to do that, but because I'm not going to demonstrate with an iron, we're going to go ahead and mark those lines with a pencil, and then fold the fabric in half again, and then make the fold this way. For this precise sample, for this precise dart sample, what I want you to do is follow me along. One thing, I will point out where you can vary from the sample, from what I'm showing, sorry. So now we made these folds. We're going to open this up and mark these lines. Now that you have done this, you're going to establish how far you want your dart to go. In my situation here, in this sample, the dart ended about 6 centimeters away from this edge. And as a result of that, because it's a straight dart, it's almost like a bowl, like a plate or a bowl. We've ended up with a plate or a bowl. This is the kind of measurement that you could vary for your samples. I do not care at which point you are going to be establishing the dart, the length of the dart itself. But once you decide on the length, you want to go ahead and mark it on your circle. And in this instance, I'm going to go ahead and choose if this sample had 6 millimeters. In my case here, I'm going to go ahead and measure out 9. Just to show you the difference, since I have one sample already done. Now, because I'm adjusting the length of the dart, the form that I'm going to end up is going to be very different. Again, in this example, you can see that because I think also the size of my circle is slightly different. I'm just reusing circles I've pre-cut before. But in this instance, the flat bottom is going to be so much smaller, and you can see that. The next step is going to be to establish how much material the dart is going to take away, is going to pinch away. So in this sample here, if I invert it back, you can see we can measure, and that we can see that this was about 2 inches from the center mark on both ends. It can be, again, you can decide to take 3 centimeters on each side. You can decide to take 2 centimeters or just 1. That part is again going to be determined by you. I want you can follow what I'm doing entirely, or you can kind of change the measurements a little bit. All right, so that's 9. All right, and so at this point, I'm going to go ahead and stick with the 2 centimeters on each side, and I'm going to go ahead and mark like this on all around. And after I mark this, I'm going to connect this point with this point and this point with this point, and basically draw a dart. And this is a straight dart. These marks here, this mark and this mark, correspond to the seam that we will be making. And so now the next steps in this process is going to be go ahead to create the seams at these lines. Because my darts are pretty short and it's going to be very difficult for me to establish a guide. I mean, I could, since this is the line, I could kind of line it up a little bit with an edge of some sort, or make a specific marking for myself. In this instance, however, I think it would be easiest to follow the guide mark here on the presser footer itself. And I went ahead and lined up my needle with this marking, and I am gonna go ahead and use that as my guide, because otherwise it's going to be somewhat difficult for me to do it in any other way. So I have I've chosen a straight stitch, obviously, and I'm choosing to use number 1 setting for the length. So this is the shortest length. And with darts, typically what you want to do is you want to start with the shortest length, and you want to end with the shortest length on the stitch, and then use the tails to tie the knots by hand. In this, because this is a sample and we're making a lot of darts here, I'm not going to ask you to tie anything together. We're just going to cut off the ends, but typically if you're making a finished product, that is something you would have to do. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and start sewing. I'm going to go ahead and change my stitch to 2. To the dial, the stitch length dial, to number 2, just so that I go a little faster. And then when I will be getting closer to the end, I'm gonna go ahead and switch it to number 1 again, to the shortest setting. Now you can just stay on the shortest setting all along, and that will be fine. In the end of the dart, you should allow your needle to just come off the fabric. There we go. And typically you would not cut off these tails this short. You would leave it about 5 to 6 centimeters, and you would tie a double knot at this end and a double knot at this end. But because these are samples, and they're not functional, they're not going to be receiving any pressure from wear and tear, or they're not going to get stuffed. It really doesn't matter. In this stitch, the number 1, the shortest length, is tight enough that it shouldn't open up. I'm going to go ahead and continue sewing all of them, and then I'll get back to you. So I finished sewing all the seams that I've identified on my sample, And you can see that because of both the different diameter circle and the different kind of like length from the edge that I chose, the length of the dart that I chose, the two forms that ended up are very different. And so let me kind of lower my camera so you can see a little bit better. There. And for this sample, I want you to be very precise. I want you to mark everything ahead of time, but the measurements, so obviously the size of the circle that you have is going to depend on a plate that you have, the largest plate that you have, unless you have a compass. And then the measurement here, the length of the dart, is going to determine the form itself of the sample you're going to end up with. Here. So this is the first sample. First, for the first sample that's going to be very precise, we're going to lay out the pattern and go and sew afterwards. So after you cut out your circle, the first thing you want to do is establish the center. If you don't have, what's the name of the tool? For the second, more organic sample, you are going to take your circle, identify the center, just like with the previous sample. But in this case, you don't necessarily have to mark all the centers of all the darts, because this one is going to be very organic. Okay, so here's our center. The center is going to be still important because our dart for this sample is going to start at the outermost edge of the circle and end in the center. And so here we have our circle with a center point. Now, I want us to end up with something fairly similar to this. And if we invert this and look at the curvatures, at the curves of the darts, these are not straight darts, we will notice that what's happening is that our curves are following a very particular, they're all very similar, and the changes from one dart to the next are very slight. So we're going to go ahead and mimic this. And if we fold this like that and kind of place this next to it, we can see that our curve should be something. I'm going to do this again. Here. It starts, there's a pinch here, and then there is a curve like this. Let me go ahead and sketch it out for you first. For this sample, I want at least 12 darts. I want you to settle on a curve, and I want you to vary it from one dart to the next very slightly, just like in this sample. And obviously, you can see that this is the variation from each dart. For half of it is very distant, very slight, and then I'm starting to vary them a little bit more drastically over here in this edge, because the contrast between the curve and the puckering that's happening is a lot more drastic. So I'm going to just randomly choose a curvature and follow it for the first seam, and then I'm going to show you how to proceed. So this is the very first dart I made that's curved. It's a very kind of simple curve that I sketched out first. I made a little bit of a mistake here, but that's not a big deal. The next step is going to open this up and move in one direction as we are kind of mimicking this curve around the circle. So I'm going to go ahead and move, and I'm going to mark this for myself so I don't forget. I'm going to go in this direction. Okay? And I want at least 12 darts, and every dart you make, you want to come to the center point from, and you want to mimic this kind of the original curve as much as you can. And so I can see that I'm starting in, I'm starting out, and then I end up in the center. So I'm going to try to mimic this. So I went ahead and finished sewing all 12 of my darts, and depending on how big your circle is, you might find that 12 darts is really excessive. So I would prefer 12 darts, but try to, if you can only do 10, that's okay. But here's the side, the wrong side of my form that I've created. Here it is. I can go ahead and cut the excess material. I think it will help my form to look better once I invert it. And I'm going to use synthetic kind of filling material to stuff my form halfway, just so that I can see what I actually ended up getting. Okay. So all the excess has been cut off, and now I'm ready to reverse it. Can use my finger to make sure that this pointy end is nicely pushed out. And I'm going to use this material just to fill it halfway, just so that I can see the kind of form I'm getting. And that way you can invert it back to look, for example, if you're getting if you're not getting smooth curves, you can invert it and take a look at your seam and adjust it, or try to understand what is actually kind of what kind of curved darts you need to create a smoother transition on the form. And so here's my organic dart sample. We were trying to go for something like this without too much preparations, just by eyeing it. And we got pretty close.